If you've been watching news or streaming platforms for the past year or so, you've probably heard of Bill C-11. But what is it? In this video, we'll explain everything about it. Welcome to this episode of Today at Work. So, if you're not aware, the Bill C-11 is an approximately 11,000 word long amendment to the Broadcasting Act. Its predecessor, the Bill C-10, has ground to a halt due to the 2021 Canadian election. These two bills specifically added digital distribution platforms and streaming service platforms to the Canadian Radio, Television, and Telecommunication Commission's, or CRTC's, regulation. This bill also seeks to force streaming services to recommend and broadcast a certain percentage of Canadian content, as defined by CRTC. This regulation will make streaming platforms a more equal playground compared to traditional broadcasters, such as over-the-air television or radio. Some advocates argue that this act is giving power to CRTC to regulate, while others argue that it affirms CRTC's right to regulate. But, once again, I digressed. But why CRTC? CRTC was originally created in 1968 to regulate traditional broadcasters such as over-the-air television and radio. On surface, it makes sense because they have already a set of rules and experience regulating traditional broadcasters. But there's some major problems with that in digital age. Before we discuss why we need regulation on traditional broadcasting methods, we need to put ourselves in that time. Over-the-air transmission requires a certain public resource, frequency. The right to use frequency is something that companies fight tooth and nail for. Some frequency naturally transmit further while carrying less information, while others transmit shorter with more information. Without a regulator that oversees the broadcasting, we risk having public resource wasted or monopolized. This is why we have CRTC, to ensure that even with foreign pressure and competition, Canadian content would always be featured and shown on Canadian networks. The purpose of the new bill is, at least officially, to ensure Canadian stories and music are widely available on streaming platforms to benefit the future generation of artists and creators in Canada. Now, we have two problems. One, do we really need CRTC to force Canadian content to be shown, given that internet distribution have, effectively in comparison to legacy TV and cable, almost unlimited options and freedom for the viewer to pick their favorite content? And secondly, does Bill C-11 really meet its original goal? Independent non-profit organization Open Media demonstrated that using old standards to define Canadian content caused big inequalities. They point out several examples that many film and videos considered Canadian is not, in fact, considered Canadian under the bill. However, the bill still requires digital distribution platforms or streaming services to broadcast a certain percentage of Canadian content via their platforms. However, with the amount of miscategorization that we see, it's possible for the public to think that there will be less Canadian content on the streaming services, not more. The problem of defining Canadian isn't alone to film and television. The existing Maple Rule, as imposed by CRTC to define Canadian content, also faced controversy and arguments. The Maple Rule, standing for Music, Artists, Performance, and Lyrics, at least two of the aforementioned criteria must be Canadian for the song to be considered Canadian. But there's a problem. The music, artists, and lyrics can now be created, generated, or synthesized by machines. With the development of AI-generated music with tools like OpenAI Jukebox, large language models that can write lyrics, vocal synthesizers that can create singing voice, and AI-generated characters, the nationality blurs. Despite that one little note about who can be considered Canadian at the bottom of the page, I fear that our current definition is no longer applicable in our digital world. And for performance, since the rise of recorders, camcorders, and internet, performance have no longer been restricted to location, whether that was intentional or not. All of these make defining the music's nationality much more difficult and prone to error. The Bill's vague and confusing description can also cause problems down the road. It might also open up third parties to responsibilities. For example, a person or a service simply distributing the information or hosting it, such as Cloudflare Stream or even Google Drive, or I could even be a part of the problem. We could be regulated as broadcasters, and we could get fined. It's like legislating FedEx can be held legally responsible because the sender didn't stuff these things it's supposed to send. Totally ridiculous if you ask me. And despite repeated promises by various branches of the Government of Canada to not regulate user-generated content, that was not, in fact, written in the Act, raising concerns about possible overreaching or false promises. The main problem about Bill C-11 is that it left multiple gray areas, lots of concerns and questions unanswered, and seemingly harmed some people to benefit others. And yet somehow, NDP, Bloc Québécois, and Liberals all approved of it. Was there lobbying, bribing, or pay-to-play? Or simply all legitimate interest involved? It's hard to tell. All we can do is spectate and hope for the better.